Well, look, why don't we start with the fact that as part of the American offer or plan, there is this talk of Russia being invited back into the G8. Given what Ukraine has experienced, how does that feel?
Well, it's certainly puzzling, to put it mildly. It's hard to imagine happening, honestly, and I think you would have to kind of have that decision by consensus, right? So if you ask the other European nations, in fact, all the other members except for the US in the G8, I'm not sure they are happy to go along with that. So that's kind of a first response. But in general, it feels somewhat surreal at this point because the war has been raging. There's so many war crimes that are being committed. Russia has not been part of the civilized world in some sense, for many years now, ever since really the full-scale invasion. So it's hard to imagine, and this is kind of the issue with this whole effort to negotiate a peace deal right now, I think, continuously. It's hard to imagine just having a quick fix to everything that's built up over the years systemically. And I think really it's hard to imagine that this is going to be successful or even possible at this point. So yeah, that is a case in point. I think it's unimaginable.
Well, we've got used to some of Donald Trump's sort of public utterances and announcements, and then quite quickly you set them alongside the reality of the outcome that is eventually produced. Is that kind of back and forth what you expect here, but that hopefully at some point something will be produced that works for both sides?
That's right. I mean, that's the idea of having negotiations, right? So you put something on the table, both sides make their offer, so put something on the table that's a very hard thing essentially for the other side to accept, and then you try to find a compromise, right? So this is a painful process, and in the end a compromise is in some sense a solution where no side is really happy, but just enough to go along. That sounds all well and good and kind of reasonable at this point, but just because of the complexity of the situation and the war and the division and the schisms that have arisen over the years, it's just very hard to imagine that this would work here in a relatively short amount of time without addressing the fundamental reasons for why this even happened
in the first place
and why it was developing over the years. It didn't just happen 4 years ago when the full-scale invasion began, right? This was a process that was really set into movement, if you want, at the end of when the Soviet Union was essentially fell apart, and then we had independence in Ukraine. So it all began then, and then over the years it sort of accelerated. So I think it's very hard to imagine just having a quick fix where you find some sort of agreement by negotiating a few points. What about Ukraine's future? What about its security? What about Russia? Is it just going to continue having a relationship with the rest of the world as if nothing happened, like we said before? Hard to imagine all of this.
Let me just quote something from the Ukrainian First Deputy Foreign Minister, who said today, almost everything we suggested was taken on board by the Americans, this is. They seemed eager to hear our point of view, which is good, positive talk, but at the same time, we see from the American peace plan that territories such as Luhansk, Crimea, Donetsk would be classified as Russian territories and recognized as such by America. Am I right to say that would not be acceptable, any part of it, to Ukraine?
Exactly. So
ever.
I think that is common knowledge to all Ukrainians. There's common knowledge in Ukrainian policy and politics. That is a clear red line. Nobody is willing to accept a permanent cessation of our territory.
Including Crimea.
Including Crimea internationally, so for everyone to recognize it as such permanently. That is the question people are happy with at this point, because there is some rationality, there is some clear thinking, obviously, about the realities on the ground. We know that militarily it's just infeasible at this point. And so there is this understanding that we can live with it for now, but there's no one in Ukraine happy to accept a permanent cessation. This is our new border.
That's interesting. Let's just go into that a bit. So are you saying that in terms of what might be possible as part of these negotiations is that there is a kind of an acceptance that for the time being, let's use Crimea as an example, Russia has Crimea, but that is a disputed ownership and that the world recognizes Ukraine's right to still dispute that ownership?
Exactly. I mean, you sort of have it in other cases other historical episodes. You can think of various scenarios or analogies. South and North Korea, for example, strictly speaking, there was never any peace. It's a cessation of hostilities that's been in place for decades now, with security guarantees for South Korea, which has allowed South Korea to become a prosperous nation, for example. Something along those lines. That's the idea.
You talked there about security guarantees. Ukraine has history of security guarantees and being let down in some of those guarantees. On the West and NATO, again, in the American plan, Ukraine wouldn't be joining NATO, but it would have US support. In what seems to be an alternative European plan that's emerged, it could join NATO depending on full consensus of NATO members, which isn't expected to be achieved at, but it would have support from NATO, protection from NATO. Give me your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, all of that sounds like a reasonable starting point to me, at least. And I think it would be to most Ukrainians. But again, the devil is in the detail. We have to really specify what's being meant here. I think we need, so referring back to what you said at the beginning, that we have sort of a unfortunate experience with guarantees. We never really had, strictly speaking, if you look into the Budapest Memorandum and all of these things, strictly speaking, we never really had guarantees. We had assurances. And that is a...
One is a much softer word, isn't it?
Sounds like it's a minor detail, but it makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, and these assurances in some sense are being met. We are being supported, we are getting weapons, all of that thing, but nobody's really stepping in to fight on our side. So that would have to be the major difference now. We want guarantees this time. Full.
Guarantees that if Russia attacks again, NATO does what? Steps
in, that we have some protection, like, for example,
Article
South
5
Korea, Article 5 types protection, but maybe from a subset of countries. South Korea has it from the US. They have US stationed troops in South Korea. Seems more than enough, maybe. So that's up to debate and up to discussion, but I think it would have to take that, not just for symbolic reasons or reasons because emotional reasons, political reasons, people feel let down, not because of that, but just because of pure rationality. If Ukraine is going to develop, and this is going to be some stable peace settlement or not a failed peace settlement, right? Because you would want this to succeed for both sides, I guess, eventually. You would want to have the certainty that Ukraine is going to develop, that investment into Ukraine is secure on some level, that it's not just going to blow up again in a couple of years' time, and therefore we're not going to look at the country even. It's just a basket case. All of these things matter, even for development.
And who do you think is Ukraine's best ally at the moment? Is it America still, despite some hard truths they may be trying to throw your way? Is it Europe? Is it EU? Is it particular countries in Europe? Is it Britain? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to sort of look at a rating or ranking of from best to worst. That's just not something.
At number 5.
Yeah, exactly. That's not something I feel comfortable doing.
Okay.
I mean, me personally, I'm grateful to all the support that we've received as a Ukrainian. I think most Ukrainians feel the same. It's clear that we've had a bumpy relationship with the US more recently. This is not a secret at all.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they've let us down. Eventually, when push comes to shove, when all the things that really mattered were considered, we did have the support and we keep getting the support. But politically, it was a bit of a rough ride. Europe has been sort of the flip side. Initially, Europe was very hesitant to really understand what was going on, especially some of the big countries in continental Europe. They were very pro-Russian at the time, or not pro-Russian, but much closer to Russia than they are today. And so this was a real shock to a lot of
Germany,
them.
for example.
Yeah. Nowadays, it's sort of the reverse. They are really at the front line of delivering support to Ukraine when it comes to defense, when it comes to financial support. So that really there's been some evolution, and perhaps you could map that into ranking where countries switch in the ranking. But I wouldn't want to obviously say who's first, who's second, and so on.
Yeah.
But we're grateful to all of them, and for sure the UK is very, very far up the list and has always been.
I wasn't looking for UK flattery,
no,
but we thank you all the same.
It's true.
We thank you all the same. On the question of land, we've touched on land. Tell me about the importance. I know there's the strategic and emotional importance of Crimea, but Tell me about the importance of Donetsk here, the Donetsk Oblast, because there is a suggestion in the American plan that goes completely to Russia permanently and is recognised as such. Why is Donetsk so important, apart from your underlying message that it's Ukraine?
Yeah, that's one of the other red lines or very difficult issues, contentious issues in this whole negotiation process. For Ukraine to just withdraw from all of Donetsk, which is still about 1/3 of the Donetsk Oblast or region that's unoccupied, would essentially, from a military perspective, from a political perspective, domestically, and to some extent economic perspective as well, is disastrous, is somewhat tantamount to a capitulation. Partly because, so if you look at the military dimension, this is one of the most fortified area in Ukraine right now. It's not a surprise, or it's not a coincidence that the Russians are having such a hard time pressing forward over the years, and they're doing it sort of inch by inch over months. If we were just to give it up, the remaining territory behind it, from a military tactical standpoint, is essentially flatland.
So it's a fundamental sort of bulwark against Russia.
Absolutely, to a large extent. And if then maybe they wouldn't even continue with the invasion, let's assume for now that they would respect the agreement. If anything were to flare up again and they would use something as a pretext, and that's the danger, and we wouldn't have security guarantees or something else, then again we can sort of see down the line how it would be very easy for them to manipulate this, to say, oh, Ukraine, again, it broke some agreement, which didn't happen. But then they would use it as pretext to then invade. And again, there would be nothing stopping them at this point. So this is a very contentious and difficult issue for Ukraine.
The size of the armed forces as well, again, a suggestion that it be 600,000 in the US plan, 800,000 in what we think is the alternative EU plan. Or not quite EU plan, but the E3 plan. I heard of a military theory or a military description today that I hadn't heard before, the porcupine theory, which is that you have a large enough army to make it uncomfortable for anyone to think about invading you. Presumably you want that. You want that porcupine scenario to exist in Ukraine.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just the classic logic of deterrence, essentially. If you want peace, you prepare for war, as the old Roman saying, I think, goes. So unfortunately, it's been true with the situation, clearly. Russia has this formidable force with a lot of battle experience now over the years. It's supremely dangerous to anybody. And if we were to just disarm, essentially, and get rid of a large portion of the deterrent factor, then again, depending on how stable this agreement is or whatever security guarantees we're going to get or what the parameters are, this is just exposing Ukraine to a future invasion. It's very dangerous. So the reasons are obvious.
Is 800,000 enough?
It's hard for me to make a statement or a judgment about what exact number you would have to have or need for the deterrent factor to be pertinent. But I think you wouldn't want to reduce the size of the military, which is about 1 million now, active, really, military personnel, very far down. So if you're talking about 800,000, sounds reasonable, probably. 600,000, maybe, I'm not sure. But again, we have a 2,000 kilometers long border with Russia. Yeah. They would obviously use the time to regroup and learn from their mistakes. They've already learned from their mistakes over the years, and quite successfully, unfortunately. So it's just a very dangerous game for us.
And for people listening who might not be familiar with the map of Ukraine and Russia, that most of the areas that you and I have mentioned are down that eastern border, aren't they? Or
that's
Crimea,
most of the areas where the combat is concentrated.
Yes, yeah.
Most of the fighting has been concentrated in the east and in the south.
But other areas are still contended.
Absolutely, and there are sort of minor invasion attempts in the north, in Sumy region, for example. Yeah. Kharkiv is constantly another battleground, quite active.
A great historic city.
Yeah, exactly, and the region, Kharkiv region. So they could really come in from a lot of places.
I read an account earlier today, or just an opinion really, two opinions of two Ukrainian soldiers still in the thick of it in the battle on that eastern front, saying two slightly different things, well, significantly different things, I guess, about how they feel about land loss. Mm-hmm. One of them was saying, look, we've lost certain land that is now almost worthless because so many people have left it and it's been destroyed. I almost feel like, let them have it. Rather than keep dying for it. Our own people keep dying for it. But his fellow soldier said too much blood has been spilt for it to just hand it back. That's the nub of the dilemma, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's basically the crux of it. And
yeah.
Depends on who you ask and depends on popular opinion in Ukraine. I think there is more war fatigue these days. So the first type of opinion that you mentioned, where people are essentially willing to stop fighting just no matter what in order to prevent more deaths, is becoming more commonplace. But the second type of opinion, where people say this cannot be all in vain, essentially, is something that's still prevalent on both sides, by the way, which again makes it more difficult, because once you lock into these heavy losses over the years, both sides feel that now they have to edge it out, because
there
why
has
the
to be
losses,
value in them.
exactly, why has all of this been in vain? What about the justification of it, essentially? So it's a very difficult process.
Can I ask you as well about domestic politics? Because in a way that takes us to domestic politics. The war is almost 4 years old now. People will be exhausted. They will have experienced a great deal of grief and loss themselves, I'm sure. There are stories swirling around Zelensky's government of corruption, of just the state more generally, of corruption. Is that starting to bite? And if it bites very deeply within Ukraine, within Ukraine's own politics, might that change how other people support you from the outside?
I think that's the risk. Certainly there is a danger of this happening, and we already see that essentially the Russian propaganda doesn't have to do much. They just repeat or essentially point their finger to these scandals that are currently appearing. It is a very bad situation for Ukraine. There's obviously nothing to be said that's good about it. Perhaps with the exception of, look, we have some institutions that are geared towards fighting corruption, and they are doing their job to some extent, and that's why you see these things come up, because the transition from a state that's very corrupt, as we used to be, kind of like Russia today, to a government or a country that's free from corruption, again, is a long and very tumultuous path.
Would you describe Ukraine as a maturing nation?
Absolutely, absolutely. But just to finish the point, so we're somewhere in between these very corrupt states and essentially a country that's free from corruption, and this process looks exactly the way...
If there is one.
Yeah, exactly. Or almost free.
Yeah.
But this process, all I'm saying is this whole effort is a tumultuous one, and this is the way it looks. It's ugly. You have people that are being put in jail, that are being obviously, involved in corruption. You kind of put light on it, and then it becomes a scandal. So that's the only positive aspect of it, but I'm not trying to defend anything. I'm saying it's a problem. Of course, it's better it didn't happen. It might affect the support that we're getting, and I can sort of understand that in some sense, because, this shouldn't have happened. There are certain examples or even ministries where it seems like there's none of this already going on, but some cases where it is. So this needs to be cleaned up.
One of the things that the American plan alludes to is elections within 100 days of any peace deal being signed. Is there an appetite for that in Ukraine?
Within 100 days?
Yeah.
Look, as I said, there is an appetite for the bloodshed to end, for the cessation of hostilities. People are very tired. People are obviously losing their relatives and, just people in general. There's both civilians and military deaths. And this constant terror.
And dislocation as well.
Dislocation, destruction, this constant terror of living essentially in a war zone without electricity or heat, by the way, and sometimes even water supply. Yeah. So, of course, if you ask people, do they want it to end? Yes, the sooner the better. But then there's also this understanding, do we want a fragile peace that's going to be seen as a failure historically and a blunder, essentially, on the part of the West? Or do we want something that's stable and permanent? And, of course, it's the latter, and that's not so easy to achieve. And, by the way, in this whole conversation that we've had, we didn't even mention for once what the other side is going to respond, what they are going to say. Because all of this is essentially just an imitation. It's just a nice exercise for us to talk about. Maybe Ukraine is going to sit down with the US and Europe, and they are going to agree on every term, on every potential point.
But what will Russia do?
But what is Russia going to respond? Maybe they're going to say, okay, all of this is nonsense to us. We want all of Ukraine, and we're going to, which is, by the way, what they're trying to hint at, I think, at the moment. Maybe it's going to boil down to just a few points or 1 point.
If I may, they tried it almost 4 years ago, didn't they?
Exactly. But even if it just boils down to 1 point that we don't agree on, that's it. There's no deal, right?
Yeah.
So all of this is so fragile to me. And unfortunately, my feeling is, given the complexity of the situation, I'm still not very optimistic as far as a quick peace deal within 100 days is concerned.
And just a final thought, in light of what you've just said there about Russia, it's about whether you have a good faith actor on the other side of the table.
Absolutely.
And you don't, do you?
I don't think so. And especially given now that they've tasted blood or smelled blood, as you say, they are on the advance, slowly, but still. They know that Ukraine is under pressure. Ukraine is somewhat crumbling from within with all these scandals. Or not crumbling, but, under attack.
Yeah.
It's not clear whether we're going to have all this support. And so economically, it's important to understand this. Let me just explain this finally, sort of towards the end. We are on the lifeline of economic support, and if it breaks down, that's it for us. Russia is still financing this war essentially by itself. It's spending 6 or 7%, maybe 8% of GDP on this war effort. But it is in a long-term structural crisis, if you want, where it's going to become more difficult increasingly over the years to do that. Whereas for us, we could be sort of held on this lifeline maybe for quite a bit of time, but it's just much harder to do politically because it's such a major effort. So that's kind of the trade-off. And unfortunately, Russia doesn't seem near a breaking point at all, right? So is it going to be yet another long period of time until we see Russia perhaps breaking? Are we going to make it through it with all these crises that are evolving? So from Russia's perspective, obviously they want to keep pressing forward, and I don't think they have this incentive to negotiate anything at this point, if they really believe, which I think they do, that they could be getting a lot more.